Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Western Standard's live coverage of the release of the report of the Rouleau Commission into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act, which we like to call we like to remind people was actually the War Measures Act by a different name. This is a coast-to-coast broadcast. We'll be joined today by David Krayden, our Ottawa correspondent, who has covered this extensively, and we have some other guests who we will introduce later in the program. But first, the thing about the inquiry, there's really three questions that it had to establish. Why did the Liberal government bring in something that used to be called the War Measures Act to deal with what appeared to be a civil protest? Secondly, what were the circumstances? What might have been weighing on their minds? And thirdly, did they go too far? Were the sweeping measures that included everything from going into people's bank accounts to monitoring cell phones to bringing out the mounted police against protesters? Was it all too much? Those are the questions that the inquiry has been looking at, and the answers are potentially damning for the Liberal government. I'm going to go now to David Krayden. As I introduced him before, he is our Ottawa correspondent. He has been following this process with enormous interest and great skill and dedication. David, what do you expect the Commission to say?
Up until yesterday, I think I was assuming that the Commission was going to basically tell us all that Justin Trudeau had no choice, that he did the right thing. I'm having very large second thoughts about this because of the retirement yesterday of RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki. And she seems to me, despite all of her own shortcomings, which are many, she seems to me to be the ideal choice for the Trudeau government to throw under the bus. And as I pointed out recently, the Trudeau government loves to throw prominent female members of the government under the bus, and they're the first to go, despite Mr. Trudeau's so-called dedication to proto-feminism. But I think now we might at least be looking for some kind of reprimand from Justice Paul Rouleau. And I think that reprimand is going to focus on the RCMP commissioner, who clearly did not do her job in briefing the Prime Minister of other options. The Emergencies Act invocation was presented essentially as the only valid option he had to deal with an imaginary crisis. And once again, the fact that it was the RCMP commissioner, along with the Ottawa police, along with the OPP, that made this protest, that made this Freedom Convoy demonstration into something it wasn't, like it was an active war, like they were trying an insurrection, that they wanted to bring down the government, that it was a crisis, it was an occupation. All of these words were used. And I think Rouleau is probably going to displace the responsibility of the Prime Minister to know what is going on, and he should know what's going on, but often doesn't, and place that on his advisors, principally the RCMP Commissioner, Brenda Lucki, who is not so lucky in this case.
Yes. So let's just say that, let's just play with that idea. This was truly a national emergency. Clearly, the occupation of the downtown core of Ottawa by a large group of people with trucks parked there was an inconvenience to people who lived around there. Many of them have been quick to point that out. But it never could have been on its own represented as a threat to national security. Remember, this act, which we now call the Emergencies Act, was called the War Measures Act. And it's essentially the same piece of legislation. I think, David, you'll comment on that in a moment. But let's just look at what happened on the borders. For a while there, the Ambassador Bridge was under siege, and there was a situation down in Coutts, Alberta, at a border crossing where nothing was moving. Maybe those things are an emergency which would justify the federal government securing its borders. What do you say?
I certainly think there was much more of an emergency at the border, whether it was in Ontario or Alberta. I dispute a lot of the police allegations that it was the convoy people who had the arms. But the real issue here is that the border problem was cleaned up fully one day before Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, the Emergencies Act. And so there was no crisis at the border when he invoked the act. It was a day after. So clearly this was aimed entirely at a bunch of blue collar truckers who had their trucks parked on Wellington Street and were having a great time. And the majority of people who were there with them, including many residents of Ottawa who weren't bureaucrats, were having a heck of a good time as well. I was there every day, freezing my hands off, interviewing people, but I couldn't believe how diverse a group this was. They weren't all a bunch of old white men. There was a lot of Indigenous people, a lot of Black people, Black women, and of course it was an Indigenous woman who was mowed down by a horse. And to say that this was really making life difficult for people downtown is absolute nonsense. And there was absolutely no need to crush this with a draconian measure like the Emergencies Act.
Right. So just as an aside, David, does the Emergencies Act, as it is today available to the federal government, differ very much from the War Measures Act that was there before?
It differs in one primary aspect. And we really haven't discussed this much during this whole period. The War Measures Act was martial law, and it was strict martial law. And I recall experiencing that martial law as a 5-year-old in Uplands, Ontario. My father was stationed there, and we tried to get into the base as usual, and there were several armed MPs with submachine guns pointing in our window and telling us that the entire country was under martial law and there was a curfew all over the country. The Emergencies Act has tempered that kind of legislation, whereas it can be localized and it's not strictly martial law. You're under the control of the police on that scene. But there's good and bad about this, because although it's not as severe as the War Measures Act that was created about 1942, it is in some ways more dangerous because it can be more easily invoked by governments like that of Justin Trudeau, because they can say, well, it's not martial law. We're not forcing people to go in their homes and not leave. We're just making an authoritarian zone here in Ottawa, or it could have been in Coutts. Wasn't there because it was over by then. But essentially what Trudeau did was make downtown Ottawa into a police state for a brief period of time, where the police controlled everything, all the traffic going in and out of that city. And I think a lot of people were afraid of that presence much more than they were of truckers beeping their horns.
Well, you said you were down there every day, and certainly I recall you writing that and some of the personal accounts that you gave, and everybody having a good time. I think there are still many people who perhaps aren't regular subscribers to the Western Standard, or who are drawing their main news information from the legacy media, who are of the opinion that this was a rowdy, out of control group of people who had their hands at the throat of the federal government. What did you see down there?
Well, I saw a lot of people who were helping each other out. The food supply was amazing, and they had a fantastic buffet going on at the baseball stadium in Ottawa where the minor leagues play. And all you had to do was drive out there. There was ample parking, and you could eat just about whatever you needed. There was no alcohol, if anyone is wondering about that. I saw no drugs, and I saw a lot of people who were very tired at times because they were up early in the morning and up late at night, but they looked after themselves. And in terms of their conduct on Wellington Street, I did not see any evidence of a trucker threatening or a protester threatening somebody wearing a mask, or someone with a sign pushing it too far in somebody's face. I saw people picking up their own garbage, something that never happens, of course, when we have other events on Wellington Street, even Canada Day. It's a mess the following day. But these people went out of their way to avoid being criticized for this sort of thing, that they weren't just a rabble creating a mess. They cleaned up after themselves. They found bathrooms. They eventually had to bring in their own porta potties because they couldn't use the facilities in hotels that refused to allow them admittance for that purpose. But there was no urination and defecation on the street, even though the city of Ottawa said they were going to issue citations for these offenses that never happened. And as we know, there was no dancing on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Nobody committed any arson. It was all made up. All of these things were completely fabricated. And there's a new report out by a Centertown group, which I mentioned in a recent column, alleging that the truckers were trying to run people down, that they were beating them up. And these stories are just so ridiculous because, of course, if any of this had actually happened, I mean, the police would have been on it and it would have made international news because they were looking for this kind of thing. They were looking for the truckers and the protesters to do something violent, unseemly, unattractive, and illegal. And I saw very little of that.
You know, David, what you're saying is generating a tremendous amount of comments in the sidebar here. I'm seeing quite a few of them. You know, Trudeau is an authoritarian. Trudeau needs to go. But there's one really, when I had to laugh. Our friend and colleague Arthur Green, who is our legislative reporter in Edmonton, just wants to ask you this: did it seem any safer than life on the Edmonton Transit?
Yeah, it seemed a lot safer than life in transit, without question. Having been on the Edmonton Transit, even safer than the Calgary Transit, a lot more than Deerfoot. Yeah, but I was out there, you know, and I never had any sense that my life was in danger. And
well, you're a military veteran yourself, David. I just seen somebody put up on the screen that they left the armed forces when the government decided to start subsidizing the mainstream media. Is that something you left before that was ever a consideration? But would you make that connection?
I would certainly make that connection because when I was in as a public affairs officer, trying to communicate the messages of the military to the public, we always knew that there was a zone of neutrality between the military and the government, and that we were there not to sell the government of the day's policies, but to communicate what the Canadian Armed Forces, in my case, the Air Force largely, was doing and what those policies were. That line has become completely eradicated under Trudeau, as it has with the police, I believe. And so the police has become politicized, but even more dangerous to our democracy, as you point out, and as I think this member here, the journalist has become a propagandist increasingly in the Trudeau state. The journalist has been bought off, and media has been bought off by the Trudeau government. We used to just say it was a problem with state media, meaning CBC, but all of this legacy media has become state media to some degree. And if you want a democracy, as I always say, it's not just about having elections every 4 years. They had elections every 4 years in the Soviet Union, but they were shams. What they didn't have in the Soviet Union was a free press or free speech. That never existed. And we're increasingly going in that direction in Canada, where the journalists are bought off, the media outlets are bought off. And now with these censorship bills being pushed through by the Liberals, I'm very concerned about the future of Canadian democracy.
Well, and you have every reason to be so, although I do think that we might need to have this discussion about the freedom of the press again soon, because I see the Globe and Mail, which is certainly not a publication that we have ever regarded as the last word on anything, has nevertheless this morning published documents released by CSIS indicating the depth to which the Chinese government was involved in our last election to try and get the result that they wanted. So I don't know whether that's going to cost them their subsidy, but the story is out there, and that was a piece of good journalism.
And I have to say, I've seen some good stories out of CBC, despite what's going on. And when they do a good thing, I applaud them. I want to see them privatized, but when they're doing their job, they deserve credit and applause for that.
Yep. No, that's going to be another subject of discussion. But first, before we, it can't be very long now before the release is coming down. But coming back to the issue of the police, you made the comment, and I agree with you, that Brenda Lucki is probably going to take the fall for this. But would it have been an issue if the Ottawa police had responded in a different way, and perhaps how should they have responded?
Well, if the Ottawa police had come down in a very overhanded manner, in a very strong, forceful manner at the beginning of this, I'm not sure it would have solved the problem, because it would have looked like the Ottawa police were the problem and that they were causing a free protest, a democratic protest, to not be allowed to function. I think it would have turned out very differently, but I'm not sure it would have turned out very, very much better, because the Ottawa police, I think, exercised some restraint at the time of the old police chief. It was when they brought in this temporary police chief who was there until quite recently. He decided that he was going to come down like a third world dictator on everybody, and it just made matters that much worse, because the police were instantly seen as people you can't trust. And as somebody who was, as you know, in the military for most of my professional career, and I worked on the Hill, I worked within the establishment for basically all my life. And I was always a hawk in terms of foreign policy, but I was always a hawk in terms of the police. I thought the police are always going to do the right thing. And you would never have seen me out there carrying signs and placards shouting at the police. But I thought all three levels of police, provincial, municipal, and federal, the RCMP, were absolutely disgraceful in their conduct and their attitude. They viewed these people as just a bunch of rubbish to be swept underfoot. These were just riffraff. And this old woman, Métis woman, who I met at the inquiry and I spoke to, she's still almost afraid to go out on the street because she was mowed down by a police horse. And this is not fabrication. It's on video. 100 people photographed it. And she had an injury. She broke her collarbone as a result of this. And she was standing on a walker. That should tell any policeman with half a brain, and that's probably not the best person to run over your horse with. But these people acted with such violence that it was shocking to me. It really upset my traditional respect for police forces.
I'm going to be a little contentious here just for the sake of it, David. Maybe the police, whether we're talking about the Ottawa City Police or the OPP or the RCMP, maybe they were put in maybe it wasn't really their fault, because they were put in an invidious position by what? By the government of Canada. I would make the case, and I've actually made it before, that, excuse me, that it was actually the actions of the government of Canada, excuse me, that caused this whole crisis. Their hard-nosed approach to public policy, lockdowns, mask mandates, travel mandates, quarantines, they created a situation of such resentment among so many people that the people came to Ottawa to say enough. I mean, if you think about it, how mad do you have to be to book off work, drive your semi across the country at your own expense, stay there at your own expense, and it was at your own expense once the funds were cut off, which was another action of the federal government. People were really mad. So what is how hard do you think we should be on the police, given that they were dealing with a situation that was caused, as I believe the inquiry will find, by the ineptitude, arrogance, and sheer ignorance of the federal government? What do you think?
There's no question the government is to blame. You cannot blame the police for what happened because we live in a democratic society. If we lived in a police state, well, yes, we could blame the police primarily. The government ultimately has to take responsibility, which, of course, the Trudeau government doesn't want to. They want to blame everybody else. I think I spoke to police officers in line, and they were very uncomfortable with what they had to do, what the orders were. However, a lot of police officers acted with undue violence, and you can talk to reporters. I wasn't one of them who got a knee to the head, but I spoke to many reporters who got knees to the head from the police. This kind of activity you expect in the third world, not in Canada. And there was acts of violence. And we have, of course, recordings, or at least transmissions, of the RCMP horse team that was staying in luxury at the Chateau Laurier as they went on and on in their private conversation about how much fun it was mowing down citizens. The sort of thing you might have expected from the Gestapo. And I was disgusted when I read that sort of thing. It should not, these are not the kind of police officers we're used to in Canada, where they should be professionals. But this is the problem when the police has become politicized. And that's the real danger here. And the police was already in the lap of Trudeau. And when
I'm seeing a lot of comments on the side that the individual police officers, if they realized that they were being used in essentially a corrupt manner, they could have said no. They could have just said, well, I'm booking off sick. I'm not coming to work. I won't do this. Is that actually a realistic option for a serving police officer or a military officer?
Not in many cases. No, I mean, everybody can't book off work. And this was an emergency situation where leaves were not necessarily feasible. So I've heard that argument from a lot of people. But it is true that if you feel you're crossing a line in your moral life, then you can quit, or you can take a leave of absence, or you can make a decision that is going to have negative consequences on your career. And of course, that option was always open to those who participated in atrocities in the Second World War. They were never forced. This is something a lot of people don't know, but people in the German army or even the SS were not forced to conduct the atrocities they did. They always had the option of saying no and of getting out. Now, the atrocities of that age, of course.
New one on me, David. I didn't realize that option never existed.
But, I think police officers, if they feel their personal morality or religious code is being violated, they should be able to say no. I think it's an unlawful order.
Do you know of any who did?
No, I'm not aware of any that did. I know of some. There was one police officer in Ottawa who donated, and she got into enough trouble for that. But I'm not aware of any police officer who refused to do his or her duty in this.
Mm-hmm. I just seen one's comment on the screen that's validating what you're saying. You make the right choice and you do the consequences. That's a hard way to live, but you wonder what people will be thinking in 10 years' time. But we're going to know very soon now, I think, what Justice Rouleau thinks. Just a few minutes now before the report is actually released, and we'll be bringing in our Ottawa reporter, Matthew Horwood, for a briefing on what they've got there. Nico, do we have Matthew waiting online? Not yet. Okay, just a couple more minutes, then these things often run late.
Always run late.
Yeah. Yes. What I think where we're going to end up here is that, and I may be proved completely wrong in a few minutes, that the government will be chastised for using the act when it didn't need to, that it was all the fault of the police for misreading the situation and misinforming the government, and heads will roll eventually. Some have rolled already, and when the Prime Minister comes on a little later, he's not going to be terribly apologetic. What do you say to that, David?
He's never apologetic unless he's apologizing for somebody else. He loves to apologize for things that happened 100 years ago and for the alleged mistreatment of this group or that group. But that's about all he ever is for an apologist. I do believe, though, one of the recommendations here is going to be that the act be somewhat watered down in order for it to be used more frequently. And I think this is, once again, a danger, because people are reluctant, and people were reluctant to use the War Measures Act. Pierre Trudeau used it. Was under incredible criticism for doing that by civil libertarians and the liberals within his own party, who thought he was being a traitor to everything he believed in. So really, it wasn't used after that. And it was the Brian Mulroney government that decided, well, we need something, but let's make it a little less onerous. Proved to be an action just as onerous is in reality as the War Measures Act was, in terms of people suffering. And this whole idea of the government shutting down and freezing bank accounts simply because you donate to a cause that he doesn't like, that was perhaps the most outrageous element of this whole story. But I do think they're going to try to make it easier to implement in the future by perhaps doing a bit of shaving here and there. And that's not, once again, necessarily a good thing. We do not need to resort to this kind of police action every time the government doesn't like the protest in front of them. Because next time it could be the protest that you don't like. Well,
that's right. You're in the saddle today. You're under the horse's hooves tomorrow. David, we're joined now by Matthew Horwood, who is going to brief us on what the report actually said. Good morning, Matthew, or good afternoon, I guess, for you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good to be here.
Okay, so Matthew, what did they say?
So they said that it was justified. Cabinet did meet the threshold for invoking the act. However, Justice Rouleau said he came to the conclusion reluctantly, and he blamed a failure in federalism and of the policing for the situation that descended into lawlessness, he said, and culminated in this national emergency. He went over in very much detail in the 150-page summary that I read skimmed over, and he laid out very in-depthly that every justification was met in order to invoke the act.
Well, we were how wrong we were. We were speculating a few minutes ago that he would not find that. So, for example, we were speaking earlier, Matthew, about the situation on the border in Alberta, Coots, which was resolved before the order was brought in. It showed that regular policing could deal with the situation. How did he deal with that?
Yeah, well, he did mention that these border crossings were cleared, but they also talked about how that they could happen again at any moment, and that the border crossing in Windsor, while it had been cleared without the use of the Emergencies Act, it would have only taken a couple of more vehicles to show up. And it also talked about how the situation was escalating. There were concerns that protests could turn violent, that more of these could be popping up, and the federal government felt they had no choice but to invoke this in order to deal with it. But there seemed to be no hesitation on Rouleau's part that the federal government made the right choice. And he detailed that all in quite a bit of detail, and we'll have it on the website pretty soon, going more in depth to it. But yeah, in a nutshell, there was seemed to be no doubt in his mind. And I know it's not the outcome that a lot of people, our readers especially, were looking for, but we're just going to have to see how this plays out in the coming weeks and what the response is.
Matthew, did Justice Rouleau make any recommendations?
He did. He made a lot of recommendations. Broadly speaking, they were on ways that the police can handle future scenarios like this. He also made a few on the Emergencies Act invocation itself and how it can be done more appropriately and in a more transparent way. He also interestingly talked about the bank accounts being frozen, and he concluded that that was a reasonable measure to have done that, although he had some criticisms with charter rights being brought down a little bit, applying to joint bank accounts, the absence of discretion being a little bit difficult for people to unfreeze their bank accounts. But again, as a whole, he said that that was an appropriate measure to give, as Christy Freeland said, economic incentives for people to leave the protest and to defuse the situation.
Matthew, I understand that you've been drinking from a fire hose for the last couple of hours, and so you may not have got to everything, but David and I were just speculating about whether the act he may have recommended that the act be liberalized somewhat, made easier to apply, a broader application, take out some of the harsher provisions in it so that it could be deployed a little more easily. And this we would obviously think was a dangerous thing. Did you see anything in the recommendations for the act itself that would suggest he's thinking that way?
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a fast reader, but I'm not that fast. So I haven't gotten to the exact recommendations that would suggest that. But as I said, there are a number of recommendations about various aspects of how this was dealt with. And I'll have to look into, going forward, how that's going to be dealt with in the future application of this act.
Okay, going to you, David. There you have it. It was all justified. What do you say?
I'm appalled. I'm absolutely appalled. And I'm not surprised that Justin Trudeau was whitewashed in this. I am surprised that the system was whitewashed as much as it was. And I'm outraged that Justice Rouleau thinks he has both the ground and the competence to comment on freezing bank accounts, because that action had nothing to do with the Emergencies Act. That occurred before the Emergencies Act was invoked. And for Rouleau to get his fingers into that and to suggest the government now has the right to freeze bank accounts of enemies of the state, of people the government just doesn't like because they're supporting the wrong people, the wrong cause, that is authoritarian. That is something you would find in a tin pot dictatorship. And I think that needs to be resoundingly criticized and made to fall.
Tin pot dictatorship. Well, we've got the colored money. What does where do you think it goes from here, Matthew? What's the next step?
Well, I think it's the biggest winner out of this is Trudeau, obviously. His supply and confidence agreement with the NDP is even more safe now. Jagmeet Singh had said that he might think about rescinding that or modifying it if the report found that it was unjustified, but it certainly looks good for him now. And I'd say going forward, probably going to have a little protest go on Parliament Hill, but I would imagine it's certainly not going to be of the size and scale. It's going to be quite small. I think a lot of people are kind of over it, and while there be some people upset with it, it's going to be, I think, a small protest in response to it.
So do you think it would be overstating the case to say that as a consequence of Rouleau's report and the recommendations that it contains, the federal government has got a free ticket to rule as directly and as harshly whenever it perceives something that could be characterized as a national emergency? I'll go to you first, Matthew, and then to you, David. Is this a ticket to do whatever they like?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't think I have the legal knowledge in order to give a succinct answer. I do think that the glass ceiling has obviously been broken for this act, and now that it's been used once, if we have a similar emergency, it could potentially be used again. But I want to push back. I don't think that the federal government is just going to invoke the act whenever it sees fit, because we did see that we have institutions in place to hold the government to account, and we had a very thorough commission and report being done to go over all the aspects of what went right, what went wrong, and what needs to be done in the future. So while I don't think that we're going to descend into some sort of dictatorship where we're constantly invoking this act in response to every little upset Canadian, I do think that if they do want to use this act again in the future, they've already done it, so they know how to pull it off, and they would potentially be more likely to do it again.
I see. David, what do you say?
Well, this is the best possible news for people who want an authoritarian government running Canada, because this gives them not just the opportunity, but carte blanche to do this as many times as they want to, so long as they can find the justification. And of course, as we know, with authoritarian governments, they can always find that justification if they need to. And apparently we have judges in this country who will back them up. This really is a sham. The whole thing has been a complete sham. But I think in the short term, anyway, this is going to help Justin Trudeau. He needed to bury this Emergencies Act inquiry as fast as possible because it has continued to simmer for the last year. And that 6 months when he was on display with his cabinet ministers did not look very good every day. I think it was a very bad moment for this government. But as I've said recently, Trudeau has moved on. He is putting all of his eggs in the healthcare basket right now, and he is going to be presenting himself as the savior of healthcare. That phenomena, that institution that Canadians apparently believe is the most important thing in their life, even when it's completely dysfunctional, even when no amount of money is going to make it work properly, and even when we're continuing to wait 28 days for heart surgery, and 226,000 Canadians go to the States every year for operations because they can't get them here in enough time before they die. So Trudeau is going to be the savior of healthcare, the guy who did everything else right, if you don't have a memory that goes back more than 3 weeks. And that's how he's going to attempt to win the next election, which I still believe could occur this year.
Well, there's something to bet on. I got one last area to throw at both of you. I'm sure that the people who objected to the presence of the convoy in Ottawa, and they have many people who agree with them across the country. It's not 100% pro-trucker, even though the Western Standard is absolutely committed to the cause of freedom. Nevertheless, there are many people who will read this and feel that their views have been validated. But right here in Alberta, my suspicion is that that's not going to be the consensus. So do you think that there is any kind of an advantage that falls to the government of Danielle Smith by having this relatively unappetizing, unapologetic defense of federal authority and how it can be used against ordinary people who just disagree with federal policy. I think she's going to profit from that. David?
I think you hit the nail on the head, and I wasn't even thinking provincially until you said that. But this is a gift from Justin Trudeau and the Liberals to Danielle Smith. And it's the stake in the heart to the Alberta NDP, because they just love those Trudeau Liberals so much. And that really drives people in Alberta crazy. And I can tell you that Danielle Smith is going to be out there saying, you need a strong Alberta. You need a strong premier like me in Alberta. You need the Alberta Sovereignty Act, because look what happened in Ottawa. We had a federal judge vindicate Justin Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act. And we're at the mercy of a Liberal government can do this again, use these authoritarian measures. And we're not going to take it in Alberta because we believe in freedom here. So this is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime for any politician. And I'm thankful it comes once in her lifetime, because I know she's going to be able to use this to her advantage.
And I think Scott Moe will as well. Matthew, how do you think the people at large in Canada are going to take this?
Well, I think a lot of people didn't pay really close attention to the inquiry as it was happening. They only saw little clips of it. But I think, they won't look into the deeper details of, just what the situation was on the ground. They will just see the headlines and see that it was justified and it was a threat to Canada, and they'll sort of go with that. What I do question is how Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, is going to deal with this news, because he did hitch himself to the Freedom Convoy early on, took sort of a calculated risk by supporting it before they even got to Ottawa, and said, during it, I support the individual right for people to protest as long as they don't remain violent. I'm curious to see whether or not he will stay on and with that and maintain what he said before, or if we'll sort of try to have and distance it, because perhaps he doesn't want to look like he's associated with people who are lawmakers and troublemakers and extremists and all these things that are sort of being described in the report. So it'll be interesting to see. He's holding a press conference today in Alberta, I believe. So definitely want to see what his reaction is and see how he deals with the freedom movement going forward, because it could be a change in the way he goes about it. I think we'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I mean, anybody who believes that Canada is truly a united country at the moment has to somehow reconcile that opinion with what has been a highly divisive situation and an exoneration, apparently, for the government of Canada. Whichever side of this debate you fall on, it is going to be difficult to find sympathy with people on the other. And I think the challenge to the federal government is to find a way to do that. Whether they would want to embrace it or not, I wouldn't care to guess. They have done so well by driving the politics of division. And really, if you follow this whole thing back to its root cause, it started, in my view, with pushing people too hard to do something that they didn't want to do. It brought people to Ottawa, and it brought out the troops, it brought out the police, and finally a judge to say that this was the right thing to do. This is a sad day for Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your support for the Western Standard. If you're not a member already, please consider it. It's the best value that you'll get in journalism. And we will see you another day. Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada. and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.